But I just threw around some more unfamiliar terms like carry and tank. And so I want to take a moment to explain those, first by sort of demonstrating sliding scales of survivability and sliding scales of damage. And the more damage you have, generally the less survivability, and vice versa. So if you find somebody, you basically can have it on one side you have survivability, and on the other side you have damage. And so let's talk about our first position, which is the carry. The carry on the sliding scale of damage versus survivability lies all the way over here, all the way on the damage side with very little survivability. Typically, also, when I say carry, I'm specifically referring to attack damage carries or auto attack carries. Some people will refer to casters as AP carries as well. To avoid confusion, I'm going to simply call the auto attackers carries and the others casters. So the people who are already familiar with this, I'm trying to level with you here. But carries fall all the way on the damage instead of survivability. They tend to have a very weak early game, but a very strong late game. And they do their damage through auto attacks. And their role on the team is to do as much damage as possible when the whole team gets together to fight. On the other end of the scale, we have the tank, who has a lot of survivability, a lot of defense, a lot of health, but doesn't really have a whole lot in the way of damage. And so their job is to absorb damage from the enemy team so that their teammates who are less survivable don't. And then at the same time, their job is also to deal a little bit of damage and also to disable certain opposing players to just sort of disrupt the other team. Tanks will be the ones who initiate team fights. Now, directly in the middle, we have what's called a bruiser. And a bruiser is typically an attack damage-based champion, and they're in between. They have more survivability than a carry, but less than a tank. And they have more damage than a tank, but less than a carry. And so they sort of fill a jack-of-all-trades position. And they do a combination of auto attacks and abilities in general to do their damage. And their role is to focus high-priority targets after the team fight starts. The tank starts the fight, and then the bruiser jumps in and focuses high-priority targets like the enemy carry. And we'll talk about team fights and the dynamics of said team fights in another later episode. We'll get to that. And then somewhere sort of outside of these roles is the caster. And generally the caster is squishier, and I say squishier, less survivable than a bruiser, but more survivable than a carry. But they also do a little bit of damage. So you have the tank, you have the bruiser, you have the carry, and then somewhere in here is the caster in general. There are various degrees of casters. There are some casters who are right around the bruiser style, and then there are some that are very, very squishy but very high damage. And they have a very wide range in that sense, and so it's important to understand that your casters cover a very wide variety of roles. And it's my favorite position to play, and we'll get into that in depth in another episode as well. But we have to move on because, well, we got to keep going. Next, we're going to talk about game-critical actions and items. And the simple term, for example, a gank is one of the biggest things that I was unfamiliar with when I first started League. I was like, what is a gank? What is a gank? And then I finally looked it up. A gank is simply a favorable engagement when you have more players on your side than they have on theirs. And it's typically referred to in the laning phase, which I'll get to. But you have, say for example, you're in your lane and you're facing off against your opponent, and you're duking it out, and then all of a sudden, out of the brush comes somebody else, and they come in and add their damage to your opponents, and now you're dead. You've just been ganked. And these can take forms of all sorts. They can be 2v1 or a 3v2. Sometimes it's as many as 4v2, 3v1. Very rarely are you going to have 5v1 or 5v2, but it does happen. So, to be ganked is not a good thing. To be ganking is a very good thing. So, we'll talk about that, especially in the jungling episode that's going to be coming up, because junglers are primarily responsible for ganks in the early game. Next thing we have to know, minions/creeps. If somebody is talking about the creeps, they're talking about the little purple and blue guys that spawn at each end of the map, and then they slowly walk to the middle, and then they fight it out with each other. They give gold and they give experience when they get killed. So they're your primary method of increasing in the game, gaining levels, gaining gold, etc. To last hit is to deal the killing damage to a minion or a creep so as to obtain gold from its death, because they only give gold to the person who does the killing blow. Now we talk a little bit about buffs. A buff is a favorable boost to performance in a specific stat or stats. Typically, if it's created by a champion's own ability, it's called a steroid. Get to that again, different episodes. These are all previews of things to come. A favorable boost also in performance bestowed on a champion by defeating a specific neutral monster. This is important for junglers especially, but the red buff, the blue buff, and the Baron buff, these are all things that will give your champion extra power if you are the one to land the killing blow on these specific neutral monsters, and we'll talk about that later. On the other hand, a debuff is exactly the opposite, which is a negative influence on performance that is inflicted on a champion by either a neutral monster or an enemy champion. And these things, they take various forms. They can be slows, they can be increased damage against that champion, they can be, they can be stuns, but any sort of debuff which results in a champion being unable or less able to perform one of three basic functions, namely moving, auto-attacking, and using abilities, is called crowd control, or CC for short. And you may have heard, you've heard of CC, and people throw around terms like hard CC as opposed to soft CC. And a hard CC, as defined by the League of Legends wiki, is any CC, any crowd control, that can cancel a channeled ability, namely an ability where the champion has to stay in place. I prefer the definition of hard CC as any crowd control that takes away two or more of the three basic functions. For example, a taunt will take away the ability to move and cast abilities and will force you to auto-attack the enemy champion. Therefore, it is a hard CC. A stun takes away all three, whereas a slow simply makes you less able to move and so is not a hard CC. Backdooring to attack the enemy team's towers without the aid of your minions, that's a big deal. You talk about laning, is simply going into a lane and killing creeps and minions and sometimes your enemy in order to gain gold and experience. And you talk about three phases of the game: laning phase, wandering phase, and team fight phase. You have early, mid, and late game. And they all look very different, and certain champions have high damage potential or high survivability potential in certain phases of the game. Some are good throughout, but that's up to each individual champion based on their scaling, based on all kinds of things. So these are more advanced topics for another later time.